Someone dismisses what you just said in front of everyone. A colleague talks over you in a meeting like you hadn't spoken at all. A family member lands a joke at your expense, and the whole table laughs, and you sit there smiling, nodding, pretending it didn't reach you. A friend brushes off something you shared like it was a minor inconvenience, not something that actually mattered to you. And somewhere between all of those moments, most of them small, none of them dramatic enough to confront directly, you absorbed a belief you probably never consciously chose. That respect is something you wait for. Something other people decide to give you, on their timeline, by their criteria, when they feel like it. That belief is the actual problem. Not the people. Not the comments. The belief. Because here's what Stoic philosophy understood about respect that most modern conversations about it completely miss. Respect is not a verdict other people hand down about you. It's a standard you set for yourself, and then, without announcement, without confrontation, without a single dramatic moment, you simply hold to it. Consistently. In the small moments. Especially in the ones that feel too minor to matter. That's what the next 20 minutes are about. 5 specific disciplines, not tips. Not tricks, not scripts you memorize and deploy. Disciplines, in the Stoic sense of the word. Practices you repeat until they become the natural expression of how you move through the world. Each one of them is quieter than you'd expect. And each one of them works precisely because it's quiet. Before we get into them, it's worth pausing on why disrespect happens in the first place. Because the answer is more useful than most people realize. The people who publicly undermine others, who interrupt, who make jokes at someone else's expense in group settings, who dismiss contributions without engagement, they're almost never operating from a position of genuine strength. What they're doing, underneath every variation of that behavior, is running a test. They're probing to find the edge of what they can get away with. They come to each interaction with an implicit hypothesis. This person will either defend themselves badly, or they won't defend themselves at all, and either response gives me something to work with. What they're not prepared for, what genuinely disrupts the pattern, is someone who doesn't take the bait. Not because they're suppressing their reaction. Not because they've decided to be the bigger person in some performance of moral superiority. But because, at a fundamental level, they simply aren't moved. Their inner equilibrium doesn't depend on this person's approval, this moment's outcome, or this comment's resolution. Marcus Aurelius spent years in the most politically volatile environment imaginable, leading an empire through plague, war, and constant internal betrayal. And the thread running through every private entry he made during those years was the same. You have power over your mind, not outside events. That's not a passive observation. He was describing the only reliable source of stability available to any person in any situation. You cannot govern how people treat you. You can govern what that treatment actually costs you. That single distinction is the architecture everything below is built on. Tip 1. First impressions are a declaration, not a performance. There's a version of first impression advice that reduces it to aesthetics. Dress well, smile appropriately, firm handshake. That advice isn't wrong, exactly, but it misses the actual mechanism underneath it, which is considerably more interesting and considerably more useful. What a first impression actually communicates is not how you look. It's whether you take yourself seriously. And people, without consciously processing it, read that signal with remarkable accuracy in a very short window. A few years ago, I was at a professional event, the kind where networking is the stated purpose even though everyone finds it mildly uncomfortable. There were 2 men I noticed specifically because they handled introductions in opposite ways. The first, whenever someone approached him, would stay in his seat, not out of arrogance, more out of habit, a low-energy social default. He'd look up, shake the offered hand from a seated position, go through the motions. He was perfectly pleasant. But something in that repeated gesture, small, unconscious, never commented on, created a friction. People's interactions with him were shorter. They moved on faster. Not because he was uninteresting, but because the signal he was sending, without knowing it, was that this encounter didn't quite merit his full presence. The second man did something simple. Every time someone approached, whether it was a senior executive or someone clearly junior to him, he stood up, made direct eye contact, gave the greeting his complete attention for those first 15 seconds. That's all. He didn't say anything more impressive than anyone else. But the response he generated was notably different. People lingered. They came back. By the end of the evening, he was the person everyone had a story about, even though he'd done nothing dramatic. What he understood, whether consciously or not, is the same thing the Stoics kept returning to. The small, deliberate actions are never really small. They're expressions of an internal orientation. Standing up when someone approaches you isn't about politeness in any superficial sense. It's a physical declaration that this moment is worth your full engagement, and that the person in front of you is meeting someone who takes themselves seriously enough to show up completely. The Stoics would frame this as living with intention in the granular level. Not just the large decisions, where to work, who to spend your life with, what to build, but the texture of ordinary interaction. Because the texture of how you engage with people accumulates into a reputation, and that reputation precedes you into every room you haven't entered yet. Here's the practical application, stripped of any mysticism. Before your next social or professional interaction, ask yourself one question. Am I bringing my actual self to this, or am I coasting? The physical indicators, eye contact, posture, full presence, are downstream of that internal question. Get the internal orientation right, and the external signals follow naturally. Try to perform the external signals without the internal foundation, and people feel the gap, even if they can't name it. Tip 2. The firm gaze. Your most powerful nonverbal response. Let me describe a specific scenario, because the mechanism here is easier to understand through a concrete situation than through abstract principle. Your mid-sentence. Sharing something that matters, a point in a meeting, a story at a dinner, a perspective in a conversation. Someone cuts across you. Not accidentally. With the particular energy of someone who decided what they had to say was simply more important than whatever you were in the middle of saying. The natural reaction, and it's almost involuntary, is to either fight for the floor back, talk faster, talk louder, compete for the airtime, or to deflate and cede it. Both responses have something in common. They let the interruption land. They confirm to the person who interrupted, and to everyone watching, that this kind of behavior produces a result. Either a reaction or a retreat, both of which are more interesting to the interrupter than what they were actually after. There's a third option that most people never consider because it seems too passive. When someone interrupts you, stop. Not in defeat, with complete intention. Stop mid-sentence, turn to look at the person who interrupted, and simply hold a level, unhurried gaze. Not a glare. Not a performance of offense. Just steady, calm, patient attention, the way you might look at something mildly interesting that you're quietly deciding how to respond to. What happens in that moment is almost mechanical. The interrupter, who came in with energy, with momentum, with the assumption that they were going to be the center of attention now, suddenly finds themselves in an unexpected situation. There's no argument to engage with. There's no visible hurt to feel satisfied about. There's just someone who has stopped and is looking at them, calmly, in a way that makes it very clear that what just happened registered and was not particularly impressive. Most people, faced with that specific silence and that specific gaze, will stumble. They'll finish what they were saying with noticeably less confidence. They'll glance at others in the room for validation they don't find. Some will actually apologize and invite you to continue. In my experience, it rarely takes more than a few seconds. I tested this at a family dinner a couple of years ago. Someone with a habit of talking over people did it to me mid-story. My instinct was to push through and try to reclaim the floor. Instead, I stopped. Said nothing. Just looked. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Felt considerably longer. The person finished their sentence, noticeably less sure of themselves, glanced around the table, and then said, unprompted, "Sorry, go ahead." I finished the story. Nobody mentioned what had happened. But something had shifted, and the same person didn't interrupt me again that evening. This is what Marcus Aurelius was getting at when he returned, again and again, to the distinction between what is within your control and what isn't. You cannot make someone stop interrupting you through argument or frustration. Both of those are attempts to control their behavior, which is outside your jurisdiction. What you can control is your response. And a calm, steady, patient response to being interrupted communicates something that no amount of arguing back ever does. That you are completely secure in your own space, and you have no particular anxiety about whether this person chooses to respect it. That security is, counterintuitively, the thing that generates respect. Not the performance of it, the actual thing. Tip 3. Ask them to repeat it. This one requires a slightly different kind of composure because it involves a moment of real discomfort, but the discomfort is almost entirely on the other person's side. When someone makes a joke at your expense, particularly in a group setting, they're operating on a specific timing mechanism. The joke lands, the group reacts, the moment passes. That's the sequence they're counting on. The reaction, whether laughter, visible embarrassment, or a defensive comeback, happens in the first few seconds, and by the time anyone has processed it, it's already become part of the social texture of the evening. Done. Filed away. Difficult to revisit without making things awkward. The way to break that sequence is to refuse to let it pass. Not by confronting it directly. That gives it the gravity the person was hoping for. But by doing something that seems almost too simple, smile in a genuinely curious way, and say, "Sorry, I didn't quite catch that." Say it again. What happens next is revealing. The person who made the joke now has to make a conscious decision. Repeat it deliberately, in a room that is no longer caught up in the energy of the moment, to someone who is looking at them with calm expectation, or back down. Most people back down. Not dramatically. They'll mutter something like, "Oh, never mind," or "it was nothing," and move the conversation along. What they were counting on was the momentum of the moment, the group energy, the first reaction window. Take those away, and the comment they were so confident about 30 seconds ago suddenly seems much less clever to everyone, including them. I watched this play out at a casual gathering a few years ago. Someone decided to retell an embarrassing story from years back, the kind that was funny to the room, but not particularly kind to the person it was about. Before the laughter had quite finished, that person smiled pleasantly and said, "That's such a good story. Tell it again. Make sure everyone heard the ending." Said with complete warmth, no edge in the voice. The storyteller, who had been performing for the room, suddenly became someone with a specific problem. They had to retell a story that now had a spotlight on it, to a person who was visibly unfazed, in a room where the spontaneous laughter was already gone. They got about 2 sentences in, stumbled, laughed nervously, and said, "Actually, you know what? It's funnier the first time." The moment dissolved entirely, but not in the storyteller's favor. Seneca wrote about the cost of letting other people's provocations occupy your mental space. The way you keep replaying an insult hours later, turning it over, feeling the sting of it, feeding it energy it never deserved. What he was pointing at was that the real damage of a public put down isn't the moment itself. It's what you carry afterward. The moment you demonstrate, to yourself as much as to anyone else, that a comment doesn't have the power to shake you, you stop carrying it. And that liberation is worth considerably more than any clever comeback you might have landed. Tip 4. The unrelated question. The pattern disrupt this is the one people resist, because it looks, from a certain angle, like avoidance. Once you understand why it works, it doesn't look like avoidance at all. It looks like the most controlled response in the room. Here's the scenario. You're at a family gathering. Someone makes a pointed comment about a decision you've made, career, relationship, lifestyle, finances. The comment is designed to land in front of an audience, which is part of its function. All eyes come to you. The room waits for your reaction. The person who said it has set up a very specific game. Respond defensively, and you've confirmed their point. Stay silent, and you've conceded it. Push back directly, and you've given them the conflict they were looking for. What you do instead is none of those things. You pause, genuinely, not performatively, and then say, in a completely natural tone, "Hey, does anyone know a good place to get coffee around here? I've been looking for somewhere new." Or, actually, did anyone see what happened in the game last night? Something entirely unrelated to what just happened, delivered as if the comment before it hadn't registered as particularly worthy of engagement. The effect is immediate and difficult to describe without having watched it happen. The person who made the comment finds themselves without a target. The energy they loaded into that moment, the anticipation of the reaction, has nowhere to go. The room, which was primed for conflict, suddenly has to pivot to an entirely different conversation. And you have moved through the moment without spending any of your actual energy on it. This is not avoidance. Avoidance is when you feel threatened and escape. This is something else. It's the conscious decision not to accept the terms of someone else's game. You didn't decline to respond because you didn't know what to say. You declined because you assessed the situation and decided that engaging on those terms wasn't worth a single unit of your attention. Epictetus's core insight was that almost nothing external can disturb you without your participation. Not the comment, not the room, not the audience. The disturbance happens in the judgment you make about those things, the story you tell yourself about what they mean and what they require of you. The unrelated question is that philosophy in action, a visible refusal to assign the comment the significance it was designed to carry. The version of this I've found most useful is to practice it in low-stakes situations first. Not a provocative family comment. Start with the smaller moments. Someone makes a mildly passive-aggressive remark in passing. Instead of engaging, you transition naturally to something entirely different. Notice what it feels like to choose not to bite. That feeling, the slight discomfort of not defending yourself combined with the quiet clarity of having stayed above it, is exactly the muscle the Stoics were training. Practice it small, and it becomes available to you when the stakes are actually high. Tip 5. Walking away is not weakness. It is triage of all 5. This is the one people resist the longest, because it usually involves someone they've known a long time. And the length of a relationship creates a specific kind of inertia, the belief that history justifies ongoing access, regardless of how that access is being used. I had a friendship for several years with someone who never quite missed the opportunity to add a slight edge to things. It was never dramatic, nothing dramatic enough to confront without looking oversensitive. A comment about a choice I'd made, delivered with just enough ambiguity to be deniable as a joke. A response to good news that landed slightly heavier than it should have. An observation about my work that was technically neutral, but somehow never quite warm. For a long time I told myself it was her communication style. That I was being too thin-skinned. That if I just showed up enough, demonstrated enough, was consistent enough, the dynamic would shift. So I kept showing up. And what I didn't notice, because it was slow, not sudden, was the low-level bracing I'd developed. The way I'd rehearse conversations before having them. The slight flattening of my energy in the days before we were supposed to see each other. That's not a friendship. That's maintenance. And maintenance is expensive, especially when it's coming entirely out of your account. The shift I made wasn't dramatic. I didn't confront her, didn't deliver a speech about what needed to change, didn't end things in a scene. I simply started declining more invitations than I accepted. I was busier. Less available. I kept things warm when we did connect, but I stopped volunteering the space. Over a few months, the frequency dropped from weekly to occasionally. And in the space that opened up, the mental and emotional space that had been quietly occupied, something unexpected showed up: clarity. About what I actually valued, what actually energized me, and what I'd been accepting as normal that had never been normal at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals about deliberately limiting his exposure to people whose company corroded his thinking, not dramatically, not with announcement, but simply by choosing where to invest his finite attention. He wasn't talking about cutting people off as an act of punishment. He was talking about triage, the recognition that time and attention are not infinite, and the conscious decision to allocate them accordingly. There's a guilt that tends to show up when you start pulling back from someone who doesn't respect you, and it's worth naming directly because it catches most people off guard. The guilt usually sounds something like, "But they need me," or "But we've been friends for so long," or "But maybe if I just stay longer, things will change." That guilt is real. It isn't a signal that pulling back is wrong. It's the natural consequence of genuinely caring about people, including people who aren't particularly careful with that care. The Stoic reframe on guilt in this context is unusually direct. Staying in a relationship that costs you your peace isn't loyalty. It's a slow transfer of your well-being into a situation that isn't using it well. Protecting your peace isn't a betrayal of the relationship. In many cases, it's the only version of the relationship that was ever going to be sustainable. Think about Sarah, a creative professional who spent months on a team where her manager routinely dismissed her ideas in front of colleagues, interrupted her in meetings, and attributed her contributions to others without acknowledgement. For a long time, Sarah's response was to work harder, to stay longer, to be more prepared, more thorough, more demonstrably excellent, in the belief that at some point the effort would be seen and the treatment would shift. It didn't shift. Because the treatment wasn't a response to her performance. It was a habit, and habits don't change because the person on the receiving end becomes more deserving. They change, if they change at all, because there's a consequence. One afternoon, in a meeting where a proposal sheet spent 2 weeks developing was waved off in 30 seconds without explanation, Sarah closed her laptop, stood up quietly, and said she was going to put her energy somewhere it was valued. Then she left. Not in anger. In decision. She submitted her resignation that afternoon. 3 months later, she was in a leadership role at a different company, one where her work was not just accepted but built upon, where her presence in a room changed the energy of it rather than requiring her to protect herself from the energy of the room. Sarah's story is not about leaving jobs. It's about the specific recognition that some environments are not going to give you what you need no matter how long you stay or how hard you work. And that staying isn't perseverance. It's just prolonged exposure to something that's costing you more than it's giving you. Knowing when to walk away isn't giving up. It's the most rigorous act of self-respect available to you. Conclusion: what these 5 actually protect run back through all 5 of them. The firm gaze. Silence as your answer. Refusing to explain your choices to people who weren't really asking out of genuine curiosity. Keeping your distance from people who consistently leave you bracing before you arrive. Holding your head high, not as performance, but as a physical expression of an internal decision about how you intend to move through the world. None of these require you to win an argument. None of them require a perfect comeback. None of them require you to be angrier, louder, or more confrontational than you currently are. Every single one of them operates on the same underlying principle, stated by Epictetus more clearly than almost anyone since. It's not what happens to you that matters. It's how you respond to it. That response, the quality of it, the consistency of it, the degree to which it reflects your actual values rather than your momentary reaction, is the only thing that's ever entirely within your control. And it turns out that the people who earn genuine, lasting respect are almost always the ones who understood that early. Who stopped spending energy trying to change how others behaved and started investing that energy in the one thing they could actually govern: themselves. Someone who disrespects you is, at some level, betting on your uncertainty about your own value. Every time you respond with calm, with patience, with the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need this particular moment to go their way in order to feel secure, you decline to pay out on that bet. Again and again, without announcement, without drama, just steadily. That steadiness, accumulated over time, is what respect actually looks like from the inside. Not a status granted by others. A standard maintained by you. Life is too short to keep reshaping yourself into whatever form keeps the people around you comfortable. Stand where you are. Hold your ground quietly. Let your actions accumulate into a reputation that precedes you. That's usually enough. Now, which of the 5 landed hardest for you today? Drop the number below. Just the number. This community will know exactly what you mean.